Welcome to Wednesday Walks Together. My name is Mark Long, rector of the parish of St Andrew in Newlands, Cape Town. I'm still busy with Rabbi Jonathan Sacks's book, The Great Partnership, God's Science and the Search for Meaning. I think, as I may have mentioned before, I've been reading it for about the last 18 to 24 months. I read sections and it then takes a while for it to settle. And I've been reading a bit more, as you've been aware, over the last few weeks. The recent part that I've touched on has had to do with relationships and also with happiness and where we find happiness in our lives. And so I'm wondering what your picture of happiness is. What defines happiness for you? Are you happy? Are you unhappy? We live, as Jonathan Sacks points out, in an age where our lives are huge steps ahead of what humanity has probably ever experienced in history. There's so much that says we should be extremely happy. But data shows that we're not happy. We're often depressed. We're struggling with stress. Life is not always what we would define as good. And so what is it that drives a lot of that? Part of it, of course, is, as you know, we live in a society, certainly in the West, that's driven by consumerism. And at the heart of consumerism is envy. That's the driving force of consumerism. It asks me to define my life not by the blessings of my life, but by the blessings of your life, and to want to, and encourages me to obtain the blessings that you have, and suggests the blessings I have really don't quite cut it. And so if you're living in that kind of context where you're always looking beyond yourself, it can be really difficult to be happy. I remember when I was a school chaplain at a prestigious school in the Lowveld, driving in daily to the school grounds behind parents' vehicles. I very rarely felt happy with my car. Driving in, I had an old Mercedes at some point, a VW Golf at another, all probably worth less than 20,000 Rand. And to drive in behind cars worth 400, 500, 600,000 or more at that stage, that's 15 years ago, the comparisons were never good. If I was sitting next to somebody with a car worth 4,000 or 5,000, well, I felt good about my car. But for most of those 4 years, I really didn't appreciate the vehicle I had, as good and as useful and as reliable as it was, because I was constantly envious by what was in front of me, or of what was in front of me. And so if we're going to really find a source of happiness, it's that we have to acknowledge that envy is part of the inherent structure of the world we live in, our economic, political, social structure. And we've got to actually become conscious of that and be willing to step away from envy, to recognize it, to call it for what it is, and to seek to live differently. What envy does is it really is the art of counting other people's blessings, not my own. And so if we just step away from that, I've got to shift my thinking. I've got to start looking at my life and what I have and the resources that are part of who I am. And part of where the happiness comes from is actually noting those resources and becoming thankful to God that those resources are part of my existence. And in doing that, there is a growing sense of this is God's gift, this is God's provision. And there's a growing happiness in embracing that. But we have to acknowledge the envy that is around us, how it has just seeped into our attitudes, the way we see life, the way we operate, the way we relate. And we have to repent of that. We have to turn from that. And we have to find a new way forward. And so Jonathan Sacks says that happiness is a state of being, not having. And still today, he says, as it always did, it depends on strong and stable personal relationships and a sense of meaning and purpose in life. Now, that's probably quite a bit of a mouthful, but I think there's a couple of things there that stand out for me. It really is about my state of being. It's not what I have. It's who I am. It's where I am. And who I am and where I am, as Jonathan says here, is defined primarily by the strength of, or the weakness of, the relationships that I have. And again, in a consumerist world where we throw things away with such ease, it's so easy to be somewhat flippant and careless with the relationships we have. It used to be that you worked in a firm for 25 years. You would build good friendships in the context of work. And of course, families and others, things would be drawn into those relationships. But today we seem to often flip from one place of work to another. We're never around long enough to develop good relationships. And even if we do, somehow there's a suggestion that if it's a work-related relationship, maybe it shouldn't be part of who we are. And that may or may not be your experience. In my context, so much of my work is social, and so friendships and relationships develop in that space. But also sometimes they can remain quite superficial, as one relates to so many people in so many ways. The other comment that Jonathan Sacks makes, of course, is that virtual communities are not really real communities. And I think, again, for myself, that's been part of my learning through this lockdown period. The virtual world has been hugely helpful in terms of enabling us to continue to worship together, to continue to hold meetings and get on with the business of life. It's been a real blessing. But I'm also aware that as we move, or I move into more in-person interactions, it's so good just to see people and not to see them just in the 2D environment, but to realize that we're 3D. There is a back to us as well as a front and sides and a top and a bottom. And there's something about in-person interaction which is just really good. And having been deprived of it over these last 6 months, to probably a greater rather than lesser degree, there's something really wonderful about just interacting again face to face. And for those of you who've had the opportunity to interact with me face to face, you have been part of God's gift to me in these weeks. So thank you for that gift. Key to all of this is that we find meaning and we find purpose in life. And I think part of what Jonathan Sacks is touching on, and certainly for me is part of my own experience, is that meaning and purpose is really wrapped up with relationship. Whether it be relationship within family, be it relationship with friends, be it relationship with colleagues and a workspace. That where those relationships are good and deepen and strengthen, I have a much stronger sense of meaning and purpose in what I'm doing. When those relationships are more superficial, I tend to lose a sense of purpose, and I tend to begin to look around and say, where could I be more meaningfully involved? And I guess underneath that is saying, actually, in this context, I'm not happy. I would perhaps be happier elsewhere. The reality of my life at the moment is that I think that there are sufficient deep and meaningful relationships around me that actually, if you were to ask me the question, am I happy? The answer is, yes, I am. I am happy. I'm happy in terms of the gift of family relationship that I have. I'm happy in terms of the friendships that I have. I'm happy in terms of my relationships with those I serve in the context of St. Andrews and the Diocese of Cape Town. Obviously, those relationships all continue to need work and can be deepened and strengthened. But it is those relationships that enable me today to say, I am happy, and to be thankful for the resource that you all are in my life at this time. So I close with the question that I opened with. Are you happy? What defines that happiness for you? Are you looking beyond yourself for it? Or are you able to find it and discover it in the resources of life and relationship that God has given you?